The man had never asked for much in life. He wasn't rich, he wasn't famous, but he was content. His home sat at the end of a quiet street, surrounded by tall trees that swayed gently in the wind. Every morning, he woke to the laughter of his children and the smell of fresh coffee brewing in the kitchen. His wife hummed softly as she prepared breakfast, and his heart felt light as he walked out the door with his briefcase in hand. At work, he was known for being honest, dependable, the kind of man who never lied or cheated to get ahead. His co-workers often came to him for advice, and his boss praised him for his dedication. Life, though simple, felt secure. But security is fragile, and happiness can become a target. The man's so-called friends, neighbors who smiled at him during the day, harbored jealousy behind their fences. They saw his family laughing together. They saw his children running free in the yard, and envy burned in their eyes. In meetings, they whispered that he thought he was better than them. At barbecues, they smiled to his face but mocked him the moment he walked away. It began at work. A new project came to the company, one with money and recognition attached. The man worked hard, but a group of co-workers, envious of his reputation, decided to destroy him. They planted false evidence, emails that made it look like he was stealing information. He denied it, of course, but the higher-ups only saw the files placed neatly in his inbox, the logs manipulated to frame him. His voice, steady and desperate, was drowned out by the false proof they presented. He was fired without warning, escorted from the building like a criminal while his colleagues whispered behind their hands. His savings dwindled quickly. Bills piled up. His wife comforted him, but fear grew in her eyes. The children asked why their father stayed home every day, why he no longer wore his tie, why he sat at the kitchen table staring at the rejection letters from other jobs. As he struggled to find work, the HOA began circling like vultures. Karen, the president, led the charge. She had never liked him. His yard was always cleaner than hers, his home better maintained, his family happier. She began with small fines. The trash can left out a few minutes too long, the grass an inch too high. When he protested, she smiled coldly and said, "Rules are rules." Soon the fines grew larger. A faded fence panel. A car parked on the street overnight. Each penalty cut deeper into the little money he had left. He tried to argue, tried to fight back, but Karen always had paperwork ready, always quoted regulations in a sharp, smug tone. Neighbors who once chatted with him now avoided his eyes, afraid they would be Karen's next target. Then came the betrayal that broke him most. One evening, when he returned home after another fruitless job interview, he found two of his closest friends, men who had shared dinners at his table, standing with Karen at his porch. They handed her papers, laughing with her, their voices low and cruel. When he confronted them, they claimed it was business, nothing personal. But their smirks told him the truth. They had sided with her, feeding her information, helping her twist rules against him. Within weeks, the man's life unraveled. The company he had given years to labeled him a thief. His neighbors whispered that he was lazy, a failure. The HOA stacked fines so high that he could no longer pay them. When he begged for leniency, Karen only tilted her head with mock sympathy. "If you can't follow the rules," she said, "maybe this community isn't for you." And then came the final blow. A letter, stamped and sealed, telling him his house would be taken. He stood in his living room, the walls echoing with his children's laughter from years before, now replaced with silence. His wife wept quietly, clutching their youngest, while the older children stared in confusion, not understanding how the world they knew could disappear overnight. The man felt hollow, stripped of everything he had built. His career, his savings, his home, his friendships, all gone in a storm of lies and betrayal. He walked through the empty rooms one last time, his footsteps heavy, his heart breaking. The laughter was gone, the warmth stolen, and only bitterness remained. The man moved into a small rented room on the edge of town, far from the neighborhood where his laughter once filled the air, the place where he had lost everything. The room was cold, the walls thin, and the sound of traffic outside was constant, but it was all he could afford. His family had gone to stay with relatives because he could not provide for them, and that emptiness carved deeper wounds than anything else. Each morning he woke alone, staring at the ceiling, the weight of failure pressing against his chest. Yet in that silence, something hardened inside him. The pain that had once crushed him slowly began to turn into fuel, a quiet fire that whispered one word into his mind over and over again: revenge. He carried a notebook, plain and black, its pages blank at first. One evening, after hours of sitting in the dim light, he opened it and wrote down the first name: his coworker who had planted the false emails. The ink looked dark and sharp against the paper, and for the first time in months, he felt a flicker of control return. The next night he added another name, then another. The boss who had fired him without listening, the neighbors who laughed at his downfall, Karen who had pushed him out of his own home. Soon the pages were filled, each line a reminder of the people who had broken his life. He didn't know how yet, but he swore he would make every name on that list pay. Days passed into weeks. He searched for work, but doors stayed closed. Instead of giving up, he turned inward, teaching himself new skills. He borrowed old computers, studied online security, and read everything he could find about systems and networks. The same way they had once used technology to frame him, he would now master it to turn the tables. At night he watched videos on strategy, on psychology, on how to expose corruption without ever being caught. His hands grew steady, his eyes sharper, his silence deeper. While the world thought he had vanished, he was rebuilding himself in the shadows. Every time he passed his old neighborhood, bitterness twisted inside him. He saw Karen walking proudly down the street, clipboard in hand, her voice raised as she barked at some poor neighbor. He saw his old friends laughing with her, their eyes smug, their faces filled with the comfort of people who thought they had one. He kept walking, saying nothing, but each step carried a promise that their laughter would not last forever. At night he dreamed of his children's faces, their confusion, their questions. Why can't we go home, Dad? Why did we have to leave? Those voices woke him in the dark, and he would sit up, gripping the notebook, his jaw tight. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about giving them back the dignity that had been stolen, about proving to them that their father wasn't weak. Revenge wasn't just desire, it was duty. Slowly, he began to act. Small things at first. He sent anonymous tips about his corrupt managers, tiny pieces of truth wrapped in careful evidence. Weeks later he read in the paper that one of them had been fired for misconduct. He felt no joy, only the steady calm of progress. He was learning how to move without being seen, how to strike without leaving fingerprints. He tested his skills on smaller targets, neighbors who had mocked him. A man who had laughed at him in the street suddenly found his hidden tax evasion exposed. Another who had helped Karen push fines woke to discover photos of his secret dealings circulating online. No one knew who was behind it, but whispers started spreading. The man watched from afar, his silence his armor, his anger his guide. He was not the broken man they thought he was anymore. He was becoming something they could not predict, something they would not see coming until it was too late. Each night, he returned to his notebook, crossing out one name at a time. Each line erased was another piece of himself reclaimed. And as the list grew shorter, his fire grew hotter. He was patient now, colder, sharper. Revenge was no longer a dream, it was a path, and he was walking it one step at a time. The man had waited long enough. His notebook now carried lines that were more than names. They were promises waiting to be fulfilled, and when the chance for the first real strike appeared he did not hesitate. His old company was thriving. The same managers who had framed him were still sitting in their offices, proud of their success, while he had been cast aside like trash. But he knew their secrets now, because he had spent months digging through every record he could find, tracing digital trails, gathering whispers from old contacts who still respected him. He discovered how they had faked expense reports, how they funneled money through side contracts, and how they manipulated data to hide their mistakes. Piece by piece, he built a mountain of evidence so strong that it could bury them alive. One quiet morning he packaged the files into a neat report, complete with dates, figures, and names, and sent it anonymously to the state regulators and the local press. Then he sat back in his small room, sipping coffee from a chipped mug, and waited. Within days, the first cracks appeared. News articles questioned the company's honesty, the headlines bold and unforgiving. By the end of the week, investigators had swarmed the office, demanding records, freezing accounts, pulling managers out of meetings in front of everyone. The man who had laughed the loudest when he was fired was suddenly splashed across the front page, his photo framed with words like fraud and embezzlement. The man read every line slowly, feeling no pity. His phone buzzed with a message from an old coworker who didn't know the truth. "You won't believe it. They're getting what they deserve." He smiled coldly and closed the message without replying. Nobody suspected him. Nobody even thought of him anymore, and that anonymity was his shield. One by one the managers were forced to resign, their careers destroyed, their reputations shredded. Some tried to deny the accusations, some tried to blame each other, but the proof was overwhelming. The company that had branded him a thief was now collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. For the man, this was not just revenge. It was justice, precise and undeniable. He crossed their names off his notebook with steady hands, each stroke of the pen giving him strength. But he didn't celebrate. This was only the beginning. He still remembered the nights when Karen's fines arrived like knives in his mailbox, the way his neighbors had laughed when he carried his boxes out of his home. They were still out there, comfortable, smug, and certain that their victim would never rise again. He watched them from a distance, his eyes calm, his face unreadable, but inside he was sharpening the blade of his patience. The first strike had shown him what he could do, how powerful he could be when he planned carefully and waited for the perfect moment. He had toppled giants without ever showing his face. Now he would turn his focus back to the neighborhood, the place where his humiliation had begun, the place where his revenge would shine brightest. The man closed his notebook, slipped it into the drawer of his desk, and whispered to himself in the darkness, "They thought they destroyed me. They only built something stronger." The man knew the company's fall was only the first step. The real wounds were still fresh in his chest, and they came from the very street he once called home. The neighbors who smiled in daylight but whispered behind his back. The ones who had turned their heads when Karen fined him into ruin. He walked past that neighborhood one evening, the sun sinking behind the rooftops, and he saw them gathered as usual, chatting with fake laughter, sipping their drinks while Karen held her clipboard like a queen holding court. They looked untouchable, proud, safe in their little world, and that was exactly what he would break. He started with whispers, small ripples that seemed harmless but grew into storms. One of the neighbors who had mocked him at his lowest was hiding an ugly secret, a debt so deep that it would ruin him if exposed. The man had found the records months ago, tucked in court documents no one ever bothered to check, and now he sent them, carefully, anonymously, to the right people. Within weeks, collection agents swarmed the man's house, knocking on his door at all hours, his car repossessed in front of shocked neighbors. The same people who had laughed with him now whispered against him, and his pride shattered in the open. The man watched from a distance, silent, unseen, but every cry of frustration from that house was music in his ears. Then came another target, the woman who once smirked when Karen fined him for a broken fence, the one who called him careless to his face. She had secrets too, photos of her meeting someone who was not her husband, messages hidden but never erased. The man sent those files in a plain envelope, slid under her spouse's door late at night. The next day the neighborhood heard shouting, glass breaking, and soon the woman's perfect image was gone, replaced by shame and whispers. She avoided the porch after that, her head low, her once loud voice silenced. Piece by piece, the man dismantled their pride. He never touched them directly, never raised his voice, but the truths he uncovered were sharper than any blade. He let them choke on their own secrets, secrets they had thought would stay buried forever. The neighborhood grew restless, fear replacing arrogance, and every time they saw a stranger walking past, their eyes darted nervously, wondering if another piece of their lives was about to unravel. And at the center of it all stood Karen, still pretending nothing could touch her, still barking at neighbors about lawns and paint colors, still holding herself above everyone else. But even she was not blind. She saw the fear around her, saw the collapse of those she once counted as allies, and deep inside she must have felt the ground shaking beneath her. The man watched her most of all, his gaze cold and patient. She was the heart of his list, the name written in darker ink than all the rest, and when her turn came, it would not just break her, it would end her reign forever. The day of the big reveal came faster than anyone expected. The HOA had called for a community gathering in the clubhouse, a place where Karen always loved to stand in front of everyone with her clipboard and her smug smile, pretending she was the protector of the neighborhood when in truth she was its parasite. The man arrived quietly, dressed plainly, his notebook tucked away in his coat, his son beside him carrying a small case that held the evidence. They slipped in among the crowd without drawing attention, but whispers followed them anyway. Some neighbors looked at him with confusion, others with guilt, remembering the times they had laughed at his downfall, and a few looked nervous, because they had secrets of their own and feared what he might bring into the light. Karen began as always, slamming the gavel on the table, her voice ringing sharp across the room. "We are here to address violations, unpaid fines, and the growing disrespect for community rules," she said, her chin raised, her eyes cutting toward him as if daring him to speak. But this time, he was not there to listen. When the room quieted, he rose to his feet slowly, and the air shifted as heads turned toward him. He walked to the front, his steps calm, his eyes steady, and when he stood beside Karen, he didn't need to shout. His voice, low but firm, carried through the silence. "You talk of rules, of respect, of fairness. But tonight we speak of truth, because truth has been missing from this room for far too long." Karen scoffed loudly, waving her clipboard. "You have no right to speak here. You lost your home, your place, your standing. You are nothing but a bitter man trying to stir trouble." He turned to her, his gaze so steady that her voice faltered. "If I am nothing, then you should not fear what I have to say. But we both know you fear it, because your empire is built on lies." He nodded to his son, who opened the case and connected a small device to the projector. The screen lit up with files, images, and documents, and gasps filled the room as the first pieces of evidence appeared. "This," the man said, pointing to the screen, "is the truth you have hidden. The fines you issued were not lawful. The funds you collected did not all go to maintenance. You used them for yourself, for dinners, for shopping, for things you never reported. And these," he clicked to another set of files, "are the voices of your allies, the ones who laughed when I was forced from my home. Records of their debts, their scandals, their betrayals. They mocked me for being weak, but tonight the mask falls." The crowd erupted with whispers, neighbors leaning close, some gasping, others glaring at Karen with anger and betrayal. Karen slammed her hand on the table, her voice breaking as she shouted, "This is all lies. He made this up. He's desperate for revenge." The man stepped closer, his voice still calm but sharp enough to cut through her shrieks. "If it is lies, then prove it wrong. Show us the receipts, the documents, the clean accounts. Until then, the truth stands before everyone here, undeniable and unforgiving." His son played the final video, the late-night footage of Karen sneaking near his home, tampering with wires, her face frozen in guilt when the porch light caught her. The room erupted again, louder this time, voices filled with outrage, some neighbors standing to their feet, pointing at her, shouting questions she could not answer. Karen's face drained of color, her voice lost in the storm of anger. For the first time, she had no control, no authority, no power. The man looked at her one last time and then turned to the crowd. "They took everything from me, but tonight, I take back the truth. And once truth is free, lies can no longer rule." The room was chaos, neighbors shouting, demanding answers, their voices filled with anger and disbelief, and Karen stood frozen in the storm she had created, her clipboard slipping from her trembling fingers, her face pale as every eye in the room turned against her. For years she had ruled with fear, but fear was gone now, replaced with fury. The man stood in the center of it all, silent, letting the noise wash over him, because he didn't need to raise his voice anymore. The truth was louder than anything he could say. Slowly the shouting died down, people waiting, watching, and he finally spoke, his tone steady and calm but sharp as steel. "You all saw what she did. You all saw the lies, the theft, the betrayal. She fined you for flowers, for fences, for trash cans, while she stole from you behind your backs. She laughed while families struggled, and she thought no one would ever stand against her. But tonight, she stands exposed. Karen tried one last time, her voice shrill and broken. He's lying. All of it is lies. You can't trust him. He's nothing. He lost everything. But before she could finish, a man in the front row shouted back, "No, Karen. We trusted you and you stole from us. He showed us the proof, and you have nothing." Another woman stood, her voice shaking with anger. "You fined me hundreds for my fence while you spent our money on yourself. You're finished, Karen." The crowd erupted again, this time with unity, voices chanting for her removal, some calling for police, others demanding she resign immediately. Karen's knees buckled, and she sank into her chair, clutching her face, the clipboard forgotten at her feet. The man turned away from her, no satisfaction on his face, only a cold calm that came from knowing the promise he had made to himself was now complete. His son unplugged the laptop, tucked it back into the case, and together they walked out of the clubhouse while the crowd surrounded Karen, their voices still rising, their judgment sealing her fate. Outside, the night air was cool and quiet, the stars spread wide above them. The man stopped on the path, looking back once at the clubhouse where his ruin had begun and his revenge had ended. His son looked up at him, pride shining in his eyes, and asked softly, "Is it over?" The man took a long breath and nodded. "It's over. They took everything from me, but I took everything back." He opened his notebook later that night in his small room, flipping through the pages filled with names. One by one, he crossed the last of them out, his pen steady, his hand firm. The list that had once been heavy with anger was now empty, its power gone, and for the first time in years, he felt light. He looked at his children's photo on the desk, their smiles frozen in time, and whispered to himself, "They will know their father wasn't weak. They will know he stood tall." In the days that followed, news spread quickly. The company that betrayed him collapsed under scandal. The neighbors who mocked him lived in shame, and Karen's name was dragged through the mud until she disappeared from the community she once ruled. And the man, once broken and forgotten, became a ghost of legend in the neighborhood. A story whispered about the man who lost everything but returned from the shadows to deliver justice. He did not boast, he did not brag, he did not need to. His revenge was complete, his dignity restored, and those who once laughed now remembered him with fear and respect. The man closed the notebook for the last time, slipped it into a drawer, and sat in silence, not as a victim anymore, but as someone who had proven that truth and patience were sharper than any blade. His story was finished, but the echoes of his revenge would linger forever in the minds of those who had once dared to take everything from him.